Great. So we should get going. It's 2 minutes past. How's everyone's week been going so far? Good. I see head nods, so I'm going to assume that
Going well.
everyone's
Going
good.
well.
It's almost Friday. Another 4 hours.
So looking at the meeting agenda, nobody has anything for the pre-talk agenda? Anything that they want to bring up or discuss?
The one thing that I'll small little complaint is I'm using the Kindle version, and the formatting is terrible. I don't know if anyone else has run into that. Like some of the sentences get cut off, and it's like it's really it's much harder to read. So
that's actually really good feedback because I'm reading the PDF version, and which is I find annoying because I can't highlight or search for text. And usually as I'm reading, I take notes right in my Kindle app, so.
Yeah.
I will pass this on, by the way.
There's probably no perfect solution, especially when you have like a lot of like graphical layout and imagery and contained.
Yeah. I don't know how you publish to Kindle, but I would imagine there's some kind of line breaks and things within Kindle that aren't set up properly.
The trouble is that PDF is primarily for print, and so not designed for any of those things. And so the way PDFs are currently put together, I used to work in publishing, so a lot of PDFs are a bit of the dog's breakfast when it comes to actually doing anything, which is why when you search, it sort of jumps around all over the place. But definitely, I will pass that feedback on. There are other better formats, but none of them are as popular as PDF, because PDF is king at the moment, for some reason.
Temporarily universal.
I have the print version of the book, and I can completely see how it would be difficult on any e-reader or small screen. For example, this section here, it's like this is graphical design is embedded into, like, I think that type of visual information would be lost if it was in a text-only version.
Believe it or not, for me reading that section, I rotated my Mac screen using the built-in like dock reader rotate.
Very sensible.
Of course, then I couldn't figure out how to undo it. I had to wait. So diving in though, that was the first section on the agenda for today. Did people have reflections or responses that they wanted to share to that section?
I just want to say I enjoyed it and I wish it was longer. I know, like they use a lot of, like they're inspired a lot by Maori traditions as far as I know. So I would have loved to learn more about that.
Likewise, I'm actually putting together a talk for the conference circuit this year around the use of storytelling and ritual in software development, which is challenging because we have these abstract ideas around storytelling and ritual and those things. We're very academic and high level. We tend to do them only in terms of religion and mythology, but how do those manifest in our day-to-day process? And it was a short section, but it gave me some threads to pull at on ways to connect it back to the work that I do. So I guess,
yeah, one part that resonated with me during this section is, I guess that's reversed. So, what are the mountains? Oh, okay.
It's only reversed for you.
Ah, that makes sense. Oh man. So what are the mountains we can only climb together? When I was thinking about that, I was thinking there's a number of different contexts you could apply that to. So I was particularly digging into like, what about GitLab, and what about a company? Like, which at GitLab we have collaboration as a value, but in like which situations is it not just a value but a necessity? I have thoughts, but nothing formulated on how to answer that. But it does raise a lot of cool ideas, I would say.
Could you pose that question again, but with different language? That might help me hook into it.
So what tasks can only be accomplished through collaboration? As a company, if we want to be as successful as possible and have the best product available, in what areas would collaboration, either between individuals or between teams, be a necessity to have that best case scenario instead of just a nice thing to have?
Do you mean outside of our company, like examples, from other industries or crafts or practices, or specifically within technology and or GitLab?
I guess one area this would become relevant is scaling. We need to make sure that there's not duplication of effort, and that people are not knowledge silos. So sharing information and collaboration is a way to make things available to everybody instead of just having specific individuals.
I guess the other side is like we're building a product for users, so we need our users to give us feedback, or even more simpler, like it's a tool that's to be used by multiple people. So it's not really meant for a single user.
Yeah, and to expand on that, I guess a good example would be triage of issues. The impact and priority of issues is often determined by impact on customers and user demand. And so without that collaboration between our users and our product managers and our engineers and developers, that is how we currently can iterate so rapidly. I feel is having a very strong chain for that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think part of the challenge of scaling a large software company is actually you want to try to do the reverse, and in a sense, like you actually don't. Collaboration can be very expensive, right? And so from an engineering perspective, we try to do very tight encapsulation where it's like you're working on this, and then here's the contract, but you don't need to talk to the other developer. They just can read the contract or however that module works or whatever the case may be. But it's interesting. I was looking at some of the tough engineering issues that we've had, whether it's scalability or performance or data loss, and these really nasty kind of things that are really tricky to figure out. And normally I think those are really tricky to figure out because they cut across all of that. And they kind of pierce that veil of encapsulation where, we're doing one thing, but it's actually a bug in Go. And then that's a bug in like a compiler or something. And so the collaboration is really, when you're trying to get to that next level of development, that collaboration, there's no way around it because encapsulation just won't handle those types of scenarios.
I was thinking about how the successful model that I've seen for those sorts of problem spaces are really around organically formed groups. So rather than having like a rigid hierarchy around products and things that, this lasts forever. Like I think my team has probably like 3 or 4 years of bugs and issues and wish lists from users that we could go implement. But looking at those cross-cutting concerns from like a larger perspective and trying to form groups within the organization that have limited lifespans, right? That we're going to tackle this sort of problem or address a larger issue. And sometimes we end up having dedicated teams for those, like, like a platform team or a scaling team or something, but having dedicated project teams where this team will only be around for 4 months, but they're going to work together on a project or a problem space that cuts across teams and is made up of members from teams on either side of whatever product divide that's causing an issue to fall between that crack.
We do have the concept of working groups, right? I'm not sure how often they're used. I think the last time was for the EEC merge, I guess. I think there was like a working group that was temporarily established.
Yeah, we've used working groups in the secure section to tackle things that kind of cut across a bunch of different teams because otherwise there's no way it falls between the cracks. And I think we also have a rapid action teams for issues in terms of reliability.
I feel like I should just say that, like, I'm not surprised. It wasn't meant to be an indictment, like, why don't we do this thing, but more just that I haven't seen it in action myself, or at least I haven't participated in one, so.
I'm definitely seeing lots of opportunities where it would make sense to have more like cross collaboration across different teams.
I think an additional problem with collaboration at scale is noise, and like that you only have a limited amount of time in the day, and you can only process a certain amount of information during that time. And if there's open communication on everything, then it is difficult to find the most directly relevant without some sort of filter in the way, I would say. I like to use issue labels for one thing, like using issue labels and searching different projects, keeping track of those things and having notifications on labels. That's a way I can keep track of things that I am most interested in or most relevant to me and support with relatively little impact. I have it routed to a separate folder in Gmail.
A major difference that I've noticed in that respect between my experience at Enspiral and my experience here, they're actually two very different places in the respect that Enspiral was very democratic and GitLab is not. In GitLab, it's listed quite plainly that it's not democratic and it is hierarchical, and that when you make a decision, you don't use consensus. In my experience, consensus does generate a lot of noise, because I found in my experience with not necessarily in Spiral, but just generally in consensus groups, is that when people have a voice and they know their voice counts equally, they tend to give their opinion, whether or not their opinion has either already been said or like they want to exercise their voice. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a negative thing, but what it leads to is a lot of noise, but also repeated things. And people giving opinions that are non-expert when there's an expert in the room. And I'm not meaning that people should always go with the expert no matter what, but what we found was with some of the communities that I've been in, that we often outvote the expert opinion. And what ends up happening is the worst. Like we get a bad outcome where we should have listened to the expert voice in the room. And that's not to say that they should always override everyone or override the community, but I found that if you can exercise collaboration, I find the collaboration here works pretty well, because there's you solicit everyone's opinion and then one person owns the decision. And I find that actually a much better model of collaboration than allowing everyone to say everything and then allowing everyone to vote. I find it a lot more efficient on everyone's time and a lot more, I guess, a lot more targeted in the result, because one person is then responsible for the result and then they therefore become the results champion. Whereas in a democratic more shared collaboration or consensus model, that doesn't tend to happen. It's like, okay, we're going to do this thing now, and then it kind of floats in the room, and no one's going to take it. And maybe one person might volunteer, but if someone really wants to do it, then they will do it. And having that directly responsible individual, I think, really helps turn that decision into action.
We always described it at Travis as the problem that when no one can say no, then no one can say yes to an idea. There's no one to like actually give you approval if there's no one to give you disapproval, and so you have to find ways to create that sort of ownership, like direct ownership of problem spaces. So at the end of the day, like, how much consensus am I going to build into my process? Which I think I just repeated what you said. So I'm demonstrating the the nature of it.
Both of you have me thinking about like open source and how open source projects are maintained. I think open source projects, there's generally a variety of people contributing to a project with some sort of shared goal, but they all have a different set of needs. And with pretty much every successful open source project, there's a limited number of individuals who can actually merge into the master branch of that project that would be distributed. And so I think that what you're both proposing, it sounds like a sound business idea and a sound method for project management, especially with anything open source, to have some people at the top who are owning a certain decision, and it can be literally traced in the Git history.
Gary, I'm curious at Travis if there was if one of the problems was people would decide on something and then no one would actually run with it because there wasn't necessarily like that person that their butt was on the line kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's similar. I've experienced this a few times on, especially here on long-running issue tickets, perhaps, where someone has come in and said, "Here's this bug or security issue or something," and no one really owns it, but a lot of us have opinions or input or advice or experience that we want to share, and we kind of share that, and we kind of grind on different engineering solutions, and then you've got 80, 90 comments on a thread, and like, what's the solution? Like, what's the actual path forward? We have lots of ideas. So we would gather lots of input, and it's very easy in those discussion modes to like, propose a response to things, and you very quickly lose the thread of what you're trying to do as a solution or a way forward. And so you have to have a disciplined approach to having somebody who's at the end of the day, their name is attached to getting the thing done, or who is explicitly in the role of moderator to say, to bring the conversation back to those base principles and say, we started at point A, we've gone down all these paths, now we're at point B, and point B is the modification of point A, with the addition of the most salient, most interested, most energizing points that we've discussed. Here's our way forward, and so on until we've reached some sort of consensus. But it does take that somebody having ownership of that process or ownership of the delivery at the end to make sure that it happens.
Yeah, I'd say at GitLab, if we didn't have the idea of iteration, you could end up in these long running things exactly like you're talking about. Because for me, iteration is like, okay, you know what? There's lots of ideas. Let's just start at one of them and let's code to screen kind of thing, so that we're not just going on. Because there's certainly issues I've seen where they just go on and on and on. And then the solution is like, all right, let's just start writing some code and seeing what happens and start somewhere.
In the
good facilitation in online discussions. Oh, sorry, Carrie.
In the Cult of Done manifesto, which I think is spiritually similar to a lot of the stuff that we do here at GitLab, one of the points is that the person with dirty hands is correct. And it's that idea of like, the person who's in it, who's actually doing it or is taking a step forward, has priority towards, the correctness of a solution. Their solution may not actually be correct, but just the simple act of moving forward and moving out of that state of uncertainty and indecision into a definitive thing that we're doing making that first step of iteration, there's value in that.
Yeah, the other expression I've heard is always a critic, never a playwright, where people are just always criticizing, but they're never actually writing the play. And it's the same kind of thing.
I've heard that
Sorry, go, John.
Where the person doing it has ownership over it. I don't think it's quite, I think that's the kind of extreme end of what you just mentioned, which is if a person's doing it, then they can just do whatever they want because they're doing it. But that's in a non-hierarchical, self-managed kind of approach. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask the same thing that Marcus is asking in the chat. The name of the manifesto escaped me, so I wanted to ask Carrie, what was it?
Oh, it's the Cult of Done, and I pasted a link into our agenda doc.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of the issues that that Loomio team solved with their software is how to turn a discussion into meaningful action, and they do so via voting and online facilitation and that sort of thing. So they saw those problems where oftentimes a group would deliberate about something and they would not be able to tell what do we decide, what are we doing now, and email trails are a nightmare, right? So they so they sort of struggle with that sort of thing. So their software directly addresses those things. And it's all about sort of democratic decision making, and there's different flavors in that. But I thought that was quite interesting. How do you turn a discussion into action? I want to mute now.
One of the steps in the cycle of learning is that they often get skipped is the period of reflection. Right, in that period of compressed action where we're actually involved in an activity, and then a period of reflection where we process what has happened. And that's on a very personal level, but that also applies to groups as well who are working on spaces or working with uncertainty.
I think if you're going to point out a problem, it would always be more valuable if you could attach a proposal or even a solution along with it. I could spend all day pointing out problems with things in life, but if I have something that is going to really contribute or add results, I think that having a proposal or ideally a solution would be perfect.
I think there's a lot of value in what you just said, and when you propose something, and it doesn't have to be right, and so it does take a lot of organizational trust. Like if I post something that's wrong, am I going to get attacked, or are people going to iterate on what I said, for example? Because there's always that fear of like, if I say something wrong, are people going to think I'm dumb or something? And so I think there's value in being able to say, I don't have the solution, but how about this thing? And it's kind of like a straw man, and then people can build on that. So sometimes say, what should we do? People say, oh, I don't know. But then if you put out a solution, like a potential proposal, even if it's totally up the wrong creek, especially if it's wrong, people will often use that as a hook to discuss it, and then some more information can come out. And so it's an interesting facilitation technique as well. But it does take organizational trust, as I say, to be able to say something that you know is probably wrong, and that it won't damage you in the process, but it will get the conversation going.
I know that I've been chewing quite a bit lately on the value of synchronous conversation as well as in real life conversation, and thinking about how we relate to each other. Again, because I'm doing this talk on this topic. And so there was the one section that was tilted sideways. It was about gathering and telling stories together. The value of contribute and how that solidifies our human relationships, and how the simple act of meeting each other, even if it's just very briefly, just like waving across like a ballroom in New Orleans, it creates a reality and a sense of trust with other people that I don't necessarily feel as a remote worker always, to be honest.
I think that cannot be overstated. I've worked remotely pretty much my entire career, and having in-person meetings, just there's nothing like it. And I think it's a requirement for teams that work remotely to have meet-space meetups, because I think the social connections you make during that carries over, and the social capital that you create with each other just creates goodwill and ability to make further, deeper connections. I just don't think there's anything like it. I just don't think, coffee chats are all great. I love them. But like I say, I think in-person meetings, you just can't not do that, I think, as an all-remote organization.
Are there any teams that have organized to use their travel bonus stipend to organize like team meetings, like mini summits around?
I didn't even know we had that. Can we link to that? Because that's a really good resource.
I think that it's $100 for a travel, Charlie. So for a New Zealander, that's gonna get you to the coast.
Yeah, I was gonna say cries in New Zealand.
I think it's $100 US anyway, for me anyway, for every person I meet when I'm traveling somewhere.
Is that the visiting grant? Are you meaning the visiting grant, or are you meaning something else? Oh, I see. The visiting grant, the person has to live in the city. So unless you have a concentration of team members in one city, then you're out of luck. That's just how because what they don't want is to have a whole bunch of people say, let's all go to Mexico or Hawaii or something, and they all meet there and none of them live there. So it has to be a person who lives in that city. So I thought there was a specific team grant, which maybe we should propose that, because that seems cool.
Yeah, there are what they call fast boots. And I know Secure did that when Secure just started, was a bunch of people got together for a week and holed up in a hotel basically to get going pretty quickly.
I know that a lot of teams do have some sort of budget for something at Contribute to do as a team, like dinners and events and outings and things. But I think it would be interesting to have let's all fly to one place at Central and work for 2 or 3 days. I don't know. We did that at GitHub and it was pretty effective.
I think that sounds amazing. I started in March of last year, so I've a little less than a year I've been here. Prior to me starting, there were support meetups. I believe there was like an America West Coast meetup in Vancouver, British Columbia, where it was a weekend meetup where it was kind of meeting of the minds. And I also believe prior to that, there was one in Thailand where it was like meet and do support tickets through the week and then get to know each other in the evening. And they both sound like just a blast to me. I would really enjoy doing that. I know it's easier for some, like those with families and pets and things. It can be tricky to get everybody in the same geographic location, and with support, we are extremely globally distributed. So it would be if there was a single support meetup, somebody's flight might cost 100, while it would be 2,000 for somebody else in the same team. But that sounds great.
I just made a note to follow up after this conversation. I'll write something up and pass it around, and maybe we can do an MR about it to the people team. Before we run out of time talking about all of this interesting stuff as we do, should we move on to another topic, or were there more follow-ups? I think we were still talking about full circle leadership. Again, I think we could spend an hour on each one of these little topics. I don't want to force it if anybody wants to continue talking on this vein.
I really enjoyed the section on full circle leadership, but I'm wondering if anybody else, as they're reading through the different types, they think, oh, that applies to me. And then they read to the next one and they say, oh, no, that applies to me. And then the next one, no, that's me, for most of them.
I definitely felt that myself. And so I started thinking about how do I manifest these different roles on different projects and in different teams. Some teams I'm the dreamer, and some teams I'm the organizer or the optimizer. And just how does that change? And that prompted me to think about the Kenefin framework for understanding systems in a similar sort of way. It tries to characterize systems and their roles in relationship to larger ecosystems.
In the document here, Kerry, you said leadership and ownership are often conflated. How does that impact our relationship to the work we do or the work we choose? Can you please elaborate on that point?
It might be a personal way of interpreting hierarchy. But I often see that the person who owns something is seen as the leader on that thing. So for example, a product owner, right there in the name, product owner, they're often also seen to be the leader in that they show us the direction and they set the priorities and do that. So it's the dual roles of both activating responsibility for something as well as the vision for something, and those are two separate identities to have in relationship to something. We have plenty of leaders in different aspects of things that don't necessarily have responsibility for delivery or responsibility for making sure something happens. And I think in hierarchical terms, we often identify leaders as being responsible for things.
When I think about ownership of something, I think being a champion for that thing getting done. And maybe this is sort of my personal interpretation here of what I've seen at GitLab and where I've seen it, where I've seen this sort of pattern is I want to get something done, but I don't know if I can do it by myself, or in fact, I can't do it by myself, otherwise I would just do it. So I have to ask other people for help. And that doesn't necessarily make me a leader in that I might follow what this other person has suggested that I do. And to me, if I ask someone for help, or whenever anyone sort of collaborates in something, I always assume that I have something to learn from them. I don't know, it's just baked into my brain that I have something to learn from everyone. And that, I think I find it's a good model for myself, because it helps me decouple those things, I think, personally, and I think maybe that's part of the answer is Mom, everyone Mom, you have are guests sleeping? I don't think so. I'm on the phone. I don't know what I was saying. This is a thing that happens. Yeah, maybe is that part of the answer to decoupling those? Is something like everyone has something to learn from everyone else, and by keeping that in mind and still doing tasks, leadership just allows the thing to nudge forward until it's done. They don't necessarily have all the answers or have all of the authority to do all the things, but they're the champion. I like the word champion because that decouples it from that sort of thing. And maybe that's why, yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, and yeah, I'm gonna stop.
No, champion's a really interesting word. And like, I'm just reflecting right now on the cultural implications of ownership versus champion. What does being a champion mean of something? And so when I'm accessing my own mythology and stories to, I don't know, identify with that word. I'm responding to it, so.
Yeah, well, champion's kind of an interesting word. Like a lot of sales organizations are always looking for that champion internally to sell to. And that person may or may not actually be the one that controls the budget, but they're the ones that are pushing through a particular deal, right? So a champion of GitLab at one of our customers might not have the purse strings to buy the software, but they are, a huge advocate for the software platform. So yeah, I think that's almost another word to throw in here of the leadership, ownership, and the champion, and kind of understanding there's slight nuances between those roles. But some of it I think depends on the organization and how resources follow those particular roles.
We're getting really close to the end of our scheduled time. And I personally have a hard stop, but obviously people can continue. Was there other topics that we wanted to touch on or ideas that people had burning?
So I just want to mention that I added this sheet with this spider graph if you want to do it as well. The nice thing is we can overlay it.
Oh, so you can get like everybody's spider graph?
Yeah, so it's just a table and then you can create the diagram in Google Sheets and it supports a spider graph. Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. That's really neat. I hadn't noticed I hadn't.
Yeah, I thought it would be fun to do the exercise, but I really don't like writing in books. So I was looking for an online tool.
Well, we'll just write in Greg's book because Greg has a physical copy. So Greg, you guys have to visit all of us and bring your book so we can.
You'll get the traveling grant.
That sounds good to me.
Tomas, I really like you bringing up the stewardship pattern. I see in the agenda that you mentioned that.
Yeah. I don't want to hold you back, Kerry. I know you have a hard stop. I really liked it because it's very often implicit in teams, and as it was in that article or in that section. And I've noticed that we've done a lot of things, and we haven't done a lot of things in my previous teams. Now it's a little bit different since it's only me and Eric on a team. It's much easier to, like, we are both supporting each other and it's just one-on-one relationship. I guess we are special in that way. But in the previous teams, the only thing that was really circulated and everybody had a chance to do that was just providing snacks for the meeting, like the retros and whatnot. That was pretty much it.
Do you think smaller teams? Do you think smaller teams would be a benefit or a complication?
I think it depends on the domain. I think Seth was mentioning it about the boundaries and how you can achieve much quicker things within the boundary, but at the same time, you might like synchronization between the teams and coming up with that interface is harder and the interface is much more set in stone. I think that from my experience, I've experienced tiny teams like this and large teams at banks, and I would still say that around the 6 felt like a good compromise for me between the traffic of information that I was able to handle, and it was useful to me.
We used to call those the perfect team size was a pizza team. It was a team that you could feed with a single large pizza.
Well, that's team of 1 for me then.
It's a very large pizza.
I think Scrum also recommends up to 7 or 8 or something.
I think, Marcus, I think that you or somebody mentioned Conway's Law as well.
Yeah, this was like in relation to this quote, those who build the house are built by the house. And Conway's Law, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, it's like that the culture of an organization is basically reflected in the products they build, like basically subconsciously. But you can't help it. And yeah, I'm encountering this law in lots of places, and it's always interesting to think about it.
Right, guys, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go. I have a group of friends waiting in a pub for me. So It was
Well,
a really good show. Yeah, good. What was that, Kerry?
oh, sorry. At least a pub is a good place to wait for somebody.
That's true. That's true. All right. I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
So yeah, I'm actually up against my stop as well. I want to thank feel free to continue. I need to drop off myself. I want to thank everybody for participating though. And I am so excited. I had so many notes that I took and so many threads to follow up on. So as ever, I am completely inspired by getting to work with all of you. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.